The man suspected of being involved in an alleged caravan terror plot is spending his...
Police in Victoria have launched a massive manhunt for the person who shot dead two Melbourne police officers early today.
Australia has had its fair share of criminals, but some take things to a whole new level. We're talking about drug lords, killers, and masterminds who got caught and thrown behind bars. These aren't just petty thieves. We're diving into the stories of Australia's most notorious criminals who are actually in jail right now. From brutal murderers to drug kingpins running billion-dollar operations, this list has it all. Some of these names made headlines for years, while others were just recently busted. Either way, their crimes shook the country, and now they're paying the price. So, get ready as we count down 10 of Australia's most infamous criminals who got caught and convicted. You won't believe some of the stories on this list. Okay, let's kick things off with a guy who seriously took things to the extreme, Bandali Debs. He's one of Australia's most notorious criminals. Debs is a convicted serial killer who's been behind bars for years now. Back in 1998, he was involved in the cold-blooded murders of two police officers, Sergeant Gary Silk and Senior Constable Rodney Miller in Melbourne. These weren't just any ordinary killings. This was an execution-style murder that shocked the entire country. But that's not all. Debs was later connected to the murders of two sex workers in the 90s, making him a major figure in Australia's dark criminal history. He managed to evade capture for a while, but it all caught up with him, and he was convicted in 2005. Now, he's serving multiple life sentences with no chance of parole. What makes his case even more chilling is the fact that Debs's actions were not just random. They were part of a calculated, violent plan. Imagine the shock when this guy, who seemed like just another bad boy, turned out to be capable of such horrific acts. His name became one of the most infamous in Australian criminal history, and to this day, he's remembered as a prime example of true evil in our midst. Debs will be locked away for the rest of his life, and with no chance for parole, he'll spend every single day behind bars paying for what he did. It's safe to say, this is one criminal who's not getting out anytime soon. Next up, we have Alan Baker, a name that'll send shivers down your spine if you know his story. This guy is no stranger to brutality. Back in 1973, Alan Baker and his accomplice, Kevin Crump, went on a killing spree that still haunts the memories of those who lived through it. Together, they murdered two innocent people, Ian James Lamb and Virginia Guy Morse, in what can only be described as a horrific, senseless act of violence. Baker wasn't just some small-time criminal. He was part of a chilling, calculated crime. The murders were brutal and left the victims' families devastated. After committing these murders, Baker and Crump were caught and convicted, but the story doesn't end there. Baker was sentenced to life in prison, and despite spending years behind bars, his reputation remains notorious. He's not a guy anyone would want to mess with. What makes this case even more unsettling is that Baker wasn't your usual criminal. He was part of a larger, terrifying story in Australia's criminal history. With some people still struggling to come to terms with the brutality of the crime, he and Crump weren't just a couple of petty thieves. They were cold-blooded killers who left behind a legacy of fear and shock. Today, Baker is still in jail, serving his life sentence. There's no getting out for him, and with no chance of parole, he'll likely remain behind bars for the rest of his life. His name has become infamous in the world of Australian crime, and for good reason. This is a guy who took violence to an extreme level, and now he's paying for it. Now, here's a guy you might not have heard of, Leon Emmanuel Sofilas. He's definitely made a name for himself though, and not for the right reasons. Sofilas was recently in the headlines in early 2025 when he was arrested for a terrifying crime that could have easily ended much worse. This guy was charged for attempting to set fire to the Newtown Synagogue in Sydney, Australia. Yeah, you heard that right. He's accused of targeting a place of worship and attempting to destroy it with explosives. But this wasn't just some random act of stupidity. Sofilas had an agenda, and it was deeply disturbing. His crime was seen as an act of domestic terrorism, and it definitely raised a lot of eyebrows in Australia. How did this guy go from being just another name in the system to someone responsible for such a terrifying plot? It turns out, Sofilas had a serious criminal history, and his arrest wasn't exactly a surprise to those who'd been following his track record. With links to far-right extremist groups, he wasn't just some guy with a grudge, he was an active threat. The authorities weren't taking any chances with this guy. Sophilus was known to have made threats before, so when he was caught, it wasn't long before they connected the dots. Currently, Sophilus is in prison, awaiting his trial for the attempted firebombing. It's still early days, but one thing's for sure. He's likely to be locked away for a long time if convicted. This isn't the kind of person who's going to get a slap on the wrist. So, expect this name to stay in the news for a while as his case develops. He might not be as famous as some other criminals, but make no mistake, he's dangerous. And his time behind bars is well deserved. Up next is Hussein Chamas, and let me tell you, this guy's story is straight out of a crime drama. Chamas isn't your average criminal. He's a suspected drug lord, and the kind of person who could have easily slipped through the cracks if it weren't for an excellent police force catching on to his operation. In January 2025, he was arrested in Sydney, Australia, for his role in a huge methamphetamine importation ring. We're talking big-time drug trafficking, like the kind of operation that involves millions of dollars and countless lives ruined by addiction. But Chamas didn't stop there. Oh no, he also had a stash of illegal firearms to boot, which only added to the pile of charges against him. He was no small player. He was one of the major players in the drug scene, and now he's facing serious consequences for it. The police managed to track him down, and the arrest was a significant win in the fight against organized crime in Australia. At the moment, Chamas is still in custody, awaiting trial. He's facing a slew of charges that could see him locked away for a long, long time. It's expected that if convicted, he could be serving decades behind bars. Australia's been fighting a growing drug problem, and someone like Chamas, he's definitely on the top of the list for making the situation worse. His capture is a big win for law enforcement, and one that'll hopefully prevent more destruction on the streets. So, yeah, keep an eye on this guy. His trial is going to be one to watch. If he's found guilty, he'll spend the rest of his life in jail, and frankly, it's where he belongs. This one's a real shocker. Paul Lesk was once a respected Crown prosecutor, someone who was supposed to uphold the law. What makes their case so chilling is the motive behind it. Ferrugia and Marshall weren't just ordinary criminals. They were motivated by some seriously dangerous beliefs. Their plot seemed to be driven by an ideology of hate, and they were planning to unleash destruction on religious sites. The thought of a couple like this, quietly planning something so sinister, was enough to make everyone sit up and take notice. Thankfully, they were caught before they could carry out their deadly plans. Both Ferrugia and Marshall have long criminal histories, and their arrest didn't exactly come as a surprise to authorities who'd been keeping an eye on them. They were part of a wider network of extremists, and it was only a matter of time before they took things too far. Now, both are behind bars, facing charges related to terrorism, explosives, and conspiracy to cause harm. The fact that they had a hit list and were willing to kill shows just how dangerous these two were. As their case moves through the courts, it's clear that this isn't going to end well for them. If convicted, they're looking at years, possibly even life, behind bars. And honestly, given the severity of their actions, that's exactly where they need to be. Graham Potter's story is one that spans over decades and feels like something straight out of a crime thriller. This guy has lived a life of crime, running from the law, and leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. He was originally convicted of murder back in 1981, a brutal crime that put him behind bars for a very long time. But that's not where the story ends for Potter. This man is not one to stay down for long. After serving time for his conviction, Potter's criminal activities didn't exactly stop. In fact, he got tangled up in a massive drug conspiracy in the early 2000s. He'd been involved in the illicit trade of drugs, and the authorities were constantly chasing him as he slipped through the cracks of the system. But eventually, after over a decade of evading capture, Potter's luck ran out. In 2022, he was finally caught in Queensland, Australia, after a 12-year manhunt. Potter is now facing some seriously heavy charges, including conspiracy to murder and drug trafficking. Authorities are treating him as one of Australia's most wanted criminals. He's been a part of some of the most dangerous operations in the country, and his capture marked a major victory for law enforcement. At this point, Potter's future looks grim. He's already been locked up again, and if convicted of the charges against him, he'll likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. He may have managed to escape justice for a long time, but it's clear now that there's no way out for him. The authorities have finally caught up with this career criminal, and it looks like his days of running are over. this next criminal is one you definitely don't want to mess with. Robert Gordon Polybank G. G was a major player in one of Australia's most notorious drug trafficking rings, running a multi-million-dollar operation that spanned across the country. He wasn't just a small-time dealer. He was the mastermind behind the scenes, pulling strings and making sure shipments of illicit substances flooded the Australian market. He had his hands in everything from methamphetamine to cocaine, and he knew exactly how to stay under the radar. Until, of course, he didn't. In 2023, after years of being one step ahead of law enforcement, G was finally caught. The police had been investigating his operation for a while, and once they gathered enough evidence, they swooped in and arrested him. The arrest was a massive blow to the criminal network, and his conviction sent shockwaves through the drug world. G's empire had been built on exploitation, manipulation, and violence, leaving countless victims in its wake. Now, G is behind bars, and he's facing some serious charges. With his massive role in the drug trade, it's looking like he's not going anywhere anytime soon. His case is still being processed, but it's almost certain that he'll be spending decades, if not the rest of his life, in prison. His name will forever be linked with some of the most dangerous criminal activities in Australia's history, and he'll likely never see freedom again. G's arrest was a huge victory for the authorities, and it sent a strong message to others who think they can hide behind their wealth and power in the drug trade. His reign as one of Australia's most notorious criminals has come to an end, and now it's time for him to pay the price. David Campbell's story is one of those where you think you've heard it all, but then you find out just how deep the rabbit hole goes. Campbell wasn't always the face of crime in Australia, but by the time authorities caught up with him, he'd become a major figure in one of the largest drug importation schemes the country had ever seen. This guy was involved in a high-stakes game of international drug trafficking, with his main gig being the smuggling of large quantities of cocaine into Australia. In 2024, Campbell was finally arrested, but not before he managed to rake in a fortune from his illegal operation. The scale of the operation was staggering. We're talking tons of cocaine, millions of dollars, and a network that reached across borders. He thought he was untouchable, operating with the kind of confidence that comes from years of getting away with it. But Campbell's luck ran out when he was tracked down overseas and eventually extradited back to Australia. Currently, he's awaiting trial in Australia, and it doesn't look good for him. His charges are absolutely serious: importing and trafficking drugs, conspiracy, and organized crime. If convicted, Campbell could be facing decades in prison, and given the scale of his operation, there's no chance he'll be walking free anytime soon. The real kicker here is how someone like Campbell could keep his life of crime going for so long. He was operating on an international scale, and yet it all came crashing down. And finally, we've got Todd Patrick Richard Ryan, a man who made a fortune by stealing from the very system that should have been protecting him. Ryan's story is a classic case of someone who thought they could outsmart the law. Once an employee of the Australian Taxation Office, Ryan was trusted with handling sensitive financial data. But instead of doing his job, he decided to use his position for his own personal gain. Over the course of several years, Ryan embezzled millions of dollars from unsuspecting Australians. But as it often goes with people who think they're untouchable, Ryan's crimes eventually caught up with him. In 2025, after an extensive investigation, Ryan was caught and arrested for his role in one of the largest tax fraud schemes in Australia's history. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the betrayal of trust. As a public servant, he was meant to protect the finances of Australian citizens, and instead, he stole from them. His actions left a huge dent in the system, and he's now paying the price for it. Currently, Ryan is serving time for his embezzlement crimes, and it's looking like he'll be behind bars for a very long time. With the amount of money he stole and the breach of trust involved, there's no chance of parole in his near future. His case is a stark reminder that no matter how clever you think you are, the law always catches up. And that wraps up our list of Australia's 10 most notorious criminals, each one with their own shocking story. From ruthless killers and extremists to masterminds of huge criminal operations, these criminals have left their mark on the country in the worst possible way. Their actions are a stark reminder of the dark side of human nature, and the lengths some will go to for power, money, or just to cause harm. The good news? They've all been caught and are now behind bars where they belong. Their reigns of terror have come to an end, and with it, the message is clear. Crime doesn't pay, no matter who you are. Thanks for watching, and make sure to like, share, and subscribe if you want to hear more about the world's most notorious criminals. Stay safe out there, and remember, crime never wins.